Teachers, what character do you play in the stories you tell yourself? Now, so often, the feelings of self-worth that we carry as a professional and as a person are really tied to the character that we give ourselves in the stories, the narratives that we tell about the events that happen in our life. And whether we portray ourselves as the hero or the victim or the villain has a huge impact on the way we feel about ourselves. I've been doing a lot of reading lately about this idea of optimism and pessimism. And I've been reading a lot of the work of Dr. Martin Seligman, who is regarded as the father of positive psychology. And in the late 1960s, Dr. Seligman did a really, really interesting experiment using dogs to test this idea of optimism and pessimism. So here's what happened. There are 3 dogs. The first dog in the first part of the experiment was simply allowed to roam around within a certain environment without any sort of external thing happening. Dog number 2 had a very random, but also very gentle, we're not talking about harming any animals here, a very gentle shock that was applied to the second dog. However, dog number 2 had a button within the enclosure that they were in, and once they learned to press the button, the shock stopped. Dog number 3 would receive the same random electric shocks that dog number 2 would, but they didn't have a button that they could press to stop the shock, and their shocks only stopped when dog number 2 found their button. So once those 3 dogs had had that experiment done, they got moved into a second enclosure. Now this enclosure could easily be jumped out of, and all 3 of the dogs demonstrated that they could get in and out of that enclosure completely on their own. Then all 3 dogs were given a shock. Dog number 1, the dog that hasn't been shocked yet, feels the shock, jumps out of the box. Dog number 2, the dog that has learned that their actions matter, has learned that when they press the button, the shock stops. They realize that they can do something about it, so they jump out of the box. But dog number 3, the dog that learned that their actions don't matter and that the shock is going to be random and not in their control, stays in the box, sits down, lays down, and continues to take this uncomfortable electric shock. And from this work, Dr. Seligman and his team were able to learn that helplessness is a learned behavior. Now, I think that too many teachers learn to be helpless. And this happens in many ways. This happens from the perception that our administration isn't supportive, that we're being suppressed by the board or the school district that we work within, or maybe the governments that influence our work are somehow putting a dampener on our ability to make a positive impact in the classroom. And in that, teachers tend to learn that their actions don't matter, and they learn to be helpless. But it turns out that you can also learn to be optimistic. And so what I want to share with you today is just an example of a way that you can practice flipping that story, changing that narrative in your own head from being helpless to being optimistic about a certain situation. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down 2 events that have happened to you in the last week that are fresh in your memory. I want you to write down something good that's happened. It can be kind of good, it can be really great, it doesn't matter. And I want you to do the same thing. I want you to write down a bad event, maybe something that was just kind of bad, not a super big deal, or maybe you had something happen this week that was incredibly bad, that you're really impacted by right now. And as you write down these two stories, I want you to think about the way that you're telling this story. And again, what character are you in this story? Now, when people are pessimistic, they tend to believe that the bad things that happen are entirely their fault. They tend to believe that the good things that happen have nothing to do with themselves. But the people that are optimistic typically see the good things that happen as something that they've been responsible for, and they see the bad things that happen as something that maybe they had some control over, but it wasn't entirely within their control to have an impact on. And so what I want you to do is I want you to write down, whether it's point form, type it out, whatever you feel, the narrative that you've told yourself about both of those stories. What role did you play in the good event, in the bad event? How much of it do you feel personally responsible for, and do you take ownership of? And once you've written that story, I want you to write the same story, but from the perspective of a different character in the story. Maybe it's a child or one of your students that was a part of that story with you. Maybe it's a colleague or one of your administrators who might have seen the story a little bit differently. And I want you to imagine how that story might be told from their perspective and what role you had to play in that story. Because I really believe that when we start to reframe the way that we characterize ourselves in our own stories, that we offer ourselves the opportunity to remember that things are very rarely ever black and white. And that the way that we perceive a certain situation is only one part of the true story that's being told, and that the true story is always somewhere in the gray. And so that when we tend to be really hard on ourselves and take responsibility for all the challenging things that happen, that really what we need to remember is there are other sides of that story, and that you are not as responsible for the bad things that happen. And on the other side, you had a bigger role to play than you think in the amazing things that happen in your classroom, in your school, in your life. So what I challenge you to do today is, if on any level in your role as a teacher you have learned to be helpless, I want you to practice telling that story in a different way, and start telling yourself a story of how you can be the hero in that story, and start to take more control so that you can be a little bit more positive about your role in your own story.